I'm going to introduce Marissiko because I think she's new to our CTL community. So I am thrilled to welcome Marissiko to Scripps College. She is the Assistant Dean of Students and the Director of SCORE. And I have the privilege of working closely with her now that I'm moving into the Associate Dean for Racial Equity at Scripps. She brings a wealth of experience and she's a great person to partner with on this topic. Our campuses are part of a group called Liberal Arts Colleges Racial Equity Leadership Alliance, or LACRELA is what we're all calling it. And this is a program through the USC Racial Equity Center that is helping to develop campus leaders in racial equity. We've been attending these workshops and are just really looking forward to sharing with you today what we've been learning and to focus on individual accountability. Marissa, do you want to say something more about your position?
No, just really thrilled to be able to be here and meet all of you. In my prior role before arriving to Scripps, I worked really closely with faculty to do a lot of training and dialogue around creating equitable classroom culture and experiences for students on campus. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for me to have this conversation with you all here. So thanks, Mary, for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about levels of accountability. And there are many levels within our community where different people need to be accountable for racial equity and different levels of power or accountability. But we can each have a role in this accountability. So I just want you to take a minute and look at this list and see where you land. Most people will be at the individual level where you can think about your classes and your own personal racial literacy. But you could also, maybe you're involved in running a program or having a large voice within your department. So those are different places where we can do this work. And it's really important that we find where our locus of accountability is and then go at it, right? Once we find that, decide what we need to do and focus on what we can do in that space rather than feeling like I don't have that power, I don't have that piece. Does that make sense? All right, I'm going to move on and say that we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to talk about some more in-depth pieces in a moment. So we thought it might be nice if you could just introduce yourselves in the breakout room. And so I'm going to send you randomly into breakout rooms. Take a minute to introduce yourselves to each other and maybe say what your highest locus of accountability is. This will be a quick breakout room. We'll give you a minute and a half for you to introduce. And I think we're small enough that I can put you all into groups of 3. So I'm going to do that right now. And we'll call you back within 2 minutes. All right, your rooms are open.
All right, great. So hopefully, we know it was a very short amount of time, but hopefully you had an opportunity to do quick introductions and just, start the conversation around where you think that you have the ability to make an impact. So we wanted to, as you think about what your level of accountability might be or your sphere of influence, right? We wanted to think about who is equity minded and how do we define that? So we took this from a definition that's shared in a book that actually came out in 2020 by Estela Ben-Simon and friends. And they describe it as practitioners or faculty who are willing to assess their own racialized assumptions, to acknowledge their lack of knowledge in the history of race and racism, to take responsibility for the success of historically underserved and minoritized student groups, and to critically assess racialization in their own practices as educators and or administrators. So this obviously has lots of different layers. And I think what we really want to highlight here is that we all have, a level of racialized assumptions that we make based on our own experiences, our own lens of the world, our own identities, intersectional identities, right? So no one is objective, no one is unbiased. We all bring those things, no matter how objective you attempt to be. And I think we can all understand that from, many different dimensions, but specifically as we think about equity, and the history of our country, the history that we know that has been incredibly inequitable and unjust to so many different communities. It's important that no matter where you are in your journey of understanding racism in this country, that there's always more to learn. And there's always going to be something that you don't know. And so it's important that you sort of enter this work thinking about the ways that your lens of the world is inevitably and inherently going to impact your practices. And so what are you doing all the time in your practice to think about ways to disrupt inequitable systems, inequitable processes, inequitable patterns, particularly as you think about your students? Are there any questions or thoughts, perspectives, responses to this definition? We have, and it's okay if you do, we have a second slide that kind of offers a different set of ways to think about equity, ways to think about racial equity. So the first, and this is from the same book, the first is that equity is a means of corrective justice for the educational debt that is owed to, in this book, they actually specifically name descendants of formerly enslaved folks, descendants of Native and Indigenous folks whose land has been stolen, descendants of folks who have been impacted by colonization, militarization, all of those things that we know exist in our history. And so equity is not just about, let me make things fair. It's actually a process of walking backwards and thinking about ways that you are going to attempt to make up for the ways that specific identities and groups of people have been disproportionately impacted, and ways that you're actually going to add more on their plate to make up for where they have been, they've had a lack of opportunity and resources. The second is that equity is inherently an anti-racist project. And the third is that equity lets practitioners see whiteness as a norm. And obviously we're thinking about racial equity. So racial equity lets practitioners see whiteness as a norm that operates through structures, policies, and practices. So understanding that whiteness is the dominant way that we operate and think about professionalism, think about success, think about how folks show up in a space and who is seen as criminal, who is seen as not worthy of being in that space. And so it's important that we understand that that whiteness and white people are not raceless, that we all have an identity and a stake in this work. And so they're sort of highlighting the ways that whiteness as a norm is something that constantly is operating in our classrooms, in our offices, and more. So I'm wondering if, based on these two slides that we've kind of talked through, if anyone has any thoughts, perspectives, responses, additions, challenges.
Jay.
So one of the things that I was thinking about, even though you said that equity is not about fairness, I think that if you take a longitudinal lens, it is, because it's about intergenerational equality. And so, which is why you have to walk back and, more than make up for it, is that it is still about, equality, but in an intergenerational, longitudinal perspective.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, in an ideal place and time, we will be able to get to a place of equality, right? I'm not sure, and I don't know if anyone might disagree or want to add. I'm not sure personally, from my own perspective, if we can ever make up for the loss that some communities have experienced. It's priceless when we think about the history, the culture, the land, the just so much that we could never put a number to in terms of money, right? Or resources. So I think for me personally, and it's not to come from a deficit, but it's hard for me to imagine how we could ever get to a place of equality, but we certainly want to do the work to at least give folks the opportunity to, just give them a little bit of a leg up from everything that's been lost intergenerationally. So thank you for adding that alternative perspective. I think it's really helpful. I know Zane, you had a comment, but I see Janet's hand is up, so we'll come to Zane right after Janet.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thanks for starting with this. I like, taking a moment to kind of norm and say, yeah, we all have some sort of biases, and let's start thinking about it. And when you were talking, it also made me, I actually came to this, I was thinking more about pedagogy and curriculum and the sort of, teaching endeavor, but I'm also realized that I'm excited for how this can help me, so I work in ITS and how ITS can benefit from all the conversations we're going to have today. So just wanted to say that.
Awesome, thank you. And I apologize. I have a neighbor, every single time I have a presentation, he decides he wants to mow his lawn. So I apologize if you hear that in the background. I promise you, anytime I have something important happening, there's a lawn being mowed. So Zane says, could you elaborate on what is meant by educational debt? Before I respond, I would love to know if any of you have thoughts or interpretations on that, because I'm sure you can interpret this many different ways, and I have only one particular way. Do folks have thoughts on how you read that?
Okay, I'll be brave and say that I probably don't have the same one as you. I don't know. But I think of it as we have prohibited education for a long time from certain groups. We're kept out of higher education. And then when we decided that, oh, okay, we'll do some education, it was separate but equal, but never equal. And then we went to the next step, and we have a whole bunch of schools and places that are really underfunded and other places that are really highly funded. And so again, intergenerationally, we have a lack of focus and attention and proper resourcing of education for Brown people and Indigenous people.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. It's that, I think it's so often we forget that, if I were to go back 3-4 generations, it was illegal for my family to even have a book to read, to have access to reading, to even be in a classroom. It was literally against the law. Right. And so we think about, we think about Indigenous folks, the ways that they were, taken out of their communities and treated, and taught to sort of get rid of their own culture and ways of knowing. And Zane, I think you're absolutely right in saying that it's the absence of particular elements in the curriculum. So it's many, many different dimensions of educational debt that I think we need to think about more holistically as we think about, particular communities who have not had access. And then even when they finally do get access, it's just the quality is just not comparable. So thank you, Mary, for offering that. Kim, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I had a question that's very similar to Zane's, but for your third point about whiteness as a norm, I'll admit that it's sometimes hard for me to see when this is happening because I come from, a white cultural background. And I guess I'd love to hear you talk about it more. And also, either now or as you go through the presentation, if you could give examples of how this manifests itself in the classroom or in interactions with students and faculty, that would be very helpful.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think we'll have time certainly throughout today. I mean, we only have a half hour left, but we'll have time to give multiple examples of the ways that shows up. And we'll move forward from here because I want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to share your experiences.
But I do want to say we go till 1:30, so we're okay.
Oh, we do go till 1:30. Oh, perfect. In my mind, I had, okay, perfect. We have
right. Okay, so when we talk about individual accountability. This is one thing that we know all of us have. Like, I don't know where everybody else's level are, so we're focusing on this individual accountability. And each of us needs to work towards that goal of equity mindedness. And it's important to recognize we are at different points in this path. And that is fine. I know many faculty struggle, like, I don't even know how to enter into this. That's okay. Identify where you are in the process and commit to continuing to learn and grow, right? So just being here is a commitment to learning and growing. I also want to say, set goals for your journey, right? Where do you want to be, or what's one thing you can commit to? Because we're all really, really busy. So if you set some goals and some benchmarks for yourself, that will keep you moving forward. Adding anti-racist pedagogies to your classroom. The CTL's offered all year an anti-racist pedagogy theme, and we've had a number of workshops to see how your colleagues are doing this in their classrooms and the different ways that they are doing that. And you can have access to those videos through our website, but we'll also give more during this session. And sometimes it's overwhelming. There's so many ideas and you're just like, oh, I'm going to throw all this in. Pick one thing and add it to your class and refine it and see how it's going. And then continue to develop your practice and improve your classes. And then you can pick another thing. So when we say add anti-racist pedagogies, it doesn't mean you have to throw a bunch of things in immediately. Pick something that you can do in your class and then see what happens. Amplifying the voices of the BIPOC members in our community is really important. Each of us, no matter your positionality, has the capacity to amplify voices of others. So think about ways that you can create space in your class for students to share their experiences, or how you can add course materials from scholars of color. Think about how you can draw attention to colleagues who are doing great work and maybe aren't being noticed. One of my favorite, one of my biggest pet peeves, so things that I try to do, is that in meetings, often somebody who is in a marginalized identity says something wonderful and people just go on. And then somebody else who is in the majoritized identity says the same thing and everybody goes, oh my God, that's great. I hate that. So if somebody says something brilliant and they're not acknowledged for it, acknowledge them, make that happen. And then if your locus of accountability permits, support, lead, or demand that your department or program do more to support racial equity on our campuses, right? So wherever your locus is, think about, can you support somebody who has power? Can you demand because you have a little power? Wherever that is, use those opportunities. Are there questions or comments about that before we move on? Jay.
Yeah, so I want to know here in terms of locus of control accountability, what does it mean? Because I know that I could incorporate, I can work very hard to incorporate anti-racist pedagogies into my classes, but I also see at a broader level, see at a program level, right? And then the problem is that does locus of control also means that, and I am empowered to demand, for example, my program director to be equity minded?
I think that is an individual. You have to see where your positionality is, right? I'm a tenured faculty member, so I can demand and I'm still going to have a job. So it's riskless for me to make demands. It could have risk for other people. So that's why I think it's important for you to assess your locus of responsibility. When I went to this session, that came up in our group when we talked about it. And one of the people said, I don't want to hear about you and your risk. If we're not all willing to take risk, then what's the point? And I think that's a really good point. But I think individuals need to say that. I shouldn't be the one to say, yes, you should absolutely demand that your dean does, right? Because I don't know what your situation is. So I think we each have to say, how can we stretch our accountability and where can we do that effectively?
But the reality is that, if the upper structures, if you're not able to make them accountable to do certain things, at the lower level, it's really very hard to do certain things. And as a person of color, you could also be overburdened because you could be very busily incorporating anti-racist pedagogies, and then you are just exhausted because the upper structures, doesn't allow you to, to breathe.
Absolutely. And I think that's the frustration many people have in our communities. And maybe that's partly coming together here and getting to know each other, because it is easier to demand or push when there's more of us doing it. So you have that access in your classroom, but as you meet people, a group of people can start to demand and push in ways that maybe you individually, it's a little harder. But I'd love to hear what other people have to say. Well, you're going to have a chance to talk more about this in your group, so we'll keep going.
All right, so one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, because I think that it's obviously incredibly relevant right now as we think about all of the racial violence that's been happening against a variety of communities, is, how to address racial violence in the classroom. And we wanted to provide a few points that Sean Harper talked about in his session, and also just offer you all the opportunity to have a dialogue with one another about what this looks like for you. So a few things that we want to highlight is that whether this is live in your classroom in a synchronous session, or if it's in a written statement that you send out to your students, it's really important to acknowledge that it's happening. I will say that when I hosted a healing circle a couple weeks ago for Asian and Asian American students around anti-Asian violence, all of them said that not one of their professors even mentioned it, said anything via email, made themselves available for support, to chat, even just acknowledged it at the start of class to say, we recognize that this is happening and this might be impacting you if you are a part of this community. And that was difficult for them because they felt invisible. And specifically when we think about Asian and Asian American students, in the ways that Asian and Asian American students are racialized, it is already so wrapped up in feelings of invisibility. And so to then be constantly targeted and to feel real threats on a daily basis about your safety, and to not have that acknowledged as having an impact on your ability to engage in the classroom, ability to complete assignments, ability to just show up and feel comfortable in a space, that's harmful. So we wanted to just sort of process through what it could look like to acknowledge the racial violence that's happening. So the first is to express how you personally feel. I think a lot of times we try to sort of like make it in an attempt to be objective, we try to say, oh, this is, I don't want to include my own personal feelings because that might come off as unprofessional or bias or whatever you might assume. And actually, when people in positions of power make it clear that they are personally impacted, that shows so much empathy, and that helps people to feel seen and heard. And so it's important to first just express how you feel, that you're hurt too, and that it saddens you to see this happening, and that this is also a difficult time for you. The second is to acknowledge the various reasons why people are angry and hurt. For those folks who might not understand, well, what's the big deal? It's important to sort of articulate why people are upset. The third is, use words that explicitly name racial violence. We try to sometimes soften the language and use broad language of diversity, equity, inclusion, and we're afraid to say that this is racist. This is racism happening, that this is because of white supremacy, that these things are happening, that what we just saw with these various folks who've been murdered by the police, that is anti-Blackness. We're afraid to say those things because we're afraid that it's too political. But the reality is that in order to actually address racial violence, you have to acknowledge that it's racial violence. So be direct and be clear and be specific about who is being targeted. And the last is, a suggestion that you may or may not take on, but ask the targeted community how they're affected and what support they need at this moment. So that might look like an email specifically to students who you know have identified with that community, and you just saying, hey, I recognize you might be impacted. If there's anything I can do to support you. That might look like an extension on a paper, might look like not having to show up to class, or maybe you offer that to all of your students. But I think that last one is probably more of a case-by-case basis. But the first three are really important as you think about ways to directly address it. Before we take you, Catherine, I don't know, Mary, if you had anything you wanted to add to this.
I wasn't going to add anything. I was just going to say we were going to put you into your group so you could have this conversation in a small group, and then we'd come back as a large group. But we're happy, Kathy, if you want to say something before then.
I had a quick question. This is lovely, and it's such a helpful guide. Thank you. I guess my question is, how do you decide when to address an issue in class? So I can imagine there are some moments where it's very clear cut, the election or the Chauvin verdict. And then these incidents are far too common, right? I mean, every day in the paper, you could find an example. And so I wondered how you make the decision when to address this in class and when not to.
That's a really great question. And, to be honest, I don't know if I personally have the answer. I think, maybe this is something that you all can chat about in your small groups, and we come back and talk about that. But I think, yeah, to your point, I mean, there's just been a slew of incidents that have happened in the last few months, and it's just time and time again. And I can tell you, I've been hosting healing circles almost on a weekly basis because there's always something new popping up. So I would love to hear from your colleagues about, what they might share as we follow up. So let's do that.
Okay, so I'm going to send you back to your breakout rooms. If you came after we set them, I will find you. So Susan, I'm going to add you to one of the groups that is smaller. Room 5 looks lonely, so I'll put you there. Seconds for people, and then we'll share in the large group. Thank you, everybody, for getting back here. We're anxious to hear what you've learned from each other. So feel free to speak out or raise your little blue hand, and we'll. Don't be shy. Zane.
In our group, we actually talked about how difficult it is to express feelings of solidarity for fear that we will be stepping on someone else's toes. Because of course, the solidarity that we express, especially around race, may run into the political sensibilities of others who are perhaps more conservative or more invested in white supremacists, or, and so we focused actually on the policing issue, that we're all happy with the verdict, even though we were dismayed by what followed with the killing in Ohio. But then could we actually extend it to say that, the police need to be brought to task and made accountable, because there are maybe some people that we're trying to express feelings of in the group that we're trying to express solidarity with, who actually, may think that it's horrible that the police were called out in this way and made accountable for what they may have thought was appropriate action, right? So it's a difficulty of navigating that kind of space that our group talked about. And I call on Janet and Katie to see if they have anything they'd like to add, since that's a group I was in.
But that was a beautiful, well said, I would say, Zane. Thank you.
I agree.
Esther.
Hi, everybody. Part of what we talked about in our group was, and this is very similar to what Zane just shared. I mentioned precisely how in sociology it's relatively easier to address race and racism precisely because of the nature of the discipline, the fact that we talk a lot about inequality. So that is an advantage that I have and that I take advantage of. So we were talking about the fact that even if you don't address the topic, not explicitly, but in terms of its content, you can still just check in and ask your students, okay, not individual students, but ask the group, how are you feeling? Do you want to talk about this? You know, so I did that this week after the verdict. I shared how I felt, you know, so I said, well, I started tearing up and I'm very happy about the result. Again, before what happened in Ohio. And that gives students permission to, and students are usually very articulate about this, to let you know, okay, how they want to handle it, right? And I also talked about, well, when we talked in the group, I'm going to share my side of this, how our positionality in terms of where we are in the hierarchy as faculty members is part of what where our fears are. In my case, also about the fact of being Dominican, which means part of the Latinx community, but I'm also Black, and there's this very, very complicated, to say the least, history in my own country about race and racism, which is part of what happens in the rest of the region in Latin America, you know, with what we call the racial democracy myth, thinking that we're not racist just because we're more mixed, which is not the case. But also in our case, in the case of the Dominican Republic, because of the relationship with Haiti and a lot of, you know, horrible things that have happened in that sense. So sometimes I'm a little bit, you know, feeling self-conscious talking about race and racism. I haven't had any problem with that, but just saying these are some of the elements of our own positionality that have to, I don't know, that we need to deal with. I don't know if anyone else from the group wants to share as well.
Chloe, do you want to share?
Sure, I'll share. I just want to say I really appreciate what Esther and Zane both just said. Those are both really helpful things to think about. I really like the idea of starting by just sharing your own experience, right? Rather than taking a particular political stance, you're sharing with students the idea that you are also experiencing these events and giving them space to do that. In my group, Susan and I were talking about a sort of related issue, the problem of, on the one hand, how to properly acknowledge these kinds of traumas and these events in classes or in other spaces where we're interacting with students, but also the concern that we both had about maybe overloading students with such acknowledgements and having them become, I was thinking about the ways that like institutions and corporations have recently become so great at like releasing a statement of concern that it now feels completely inauthentic and, you know, something that we just sort of breeze right by, right? So on the one hand, we want to acknowledge and make space with our students. On the other hand, I'm sure they don't want racial violence acknowledged, you know, 5 times a day. And we have to like cover the things we're covering in our own classes. So we were just thinking about that and different ways to, you know, sending emails, using other kinds of messaging systems outside of class as multiple channels to sort of get that message across or make space for students, and not always necessarily bringing it up in class, though sometimes we do want to bring it up in class. This morning I had, I'm teaching a class on Sikhism this semester. So this morning, of course, we had like a big conversation about Indianapolis, and I didn't talk at all about the Chauvin decision or about Ohio. And I feel like these are absences, but I also only had space to do so much in one class. So that's what Susan and I were discussing in our group, and it was helpful.
I'm glad it was helpful. Others? Okay, we'll have Marissiko go on and help us a little bit with ways to work through some of this.
Well, thank you all, yeah, for sharing. I mean, these are all really, really, really valid concerns, and what we're constantly negotiating as, you know, and I'm negotiating that, even being the director of a center that is supposed to house these conversations, right? Like, I'm constantly thinking about not wanting to project emotional burdens onto students too much. I also think that we have to think about what it means to avoid the conversations. Sometimes in our attempt to not want to say the wrong thing or not want to overburden, we end up just saying, well, I just won't say anything at all. And what Sean Harper did is kind of talk through some of the impacts of that. So what it looks like is oftentimes we will talk about these things in small groups. We will find that one colleague who we trust and have a great relationship with, and we'll be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. This is awful. Or we will have seen, or, you know, a particular racialized or racist incident happen in the workplace or happen between someone or that the institution did, and we'll talk about it with that one or those other folks who we trust, and never talk about it broadly. And oftentimes it's only in the aftermath of a significant racial crisis that we think it's important to address these things, that we think it's important to acknowledge that racism is living and breathing all around us. And what that does is it leaves the burden on oftentimes Black folks, to be, if we're being honest. We leave the burden to Black students, Black faculty, Black administrators, who again are constantly seen as the ultimate object of oppression, given the history of our country and how we have developed the social construction of race, right? Knowing that Blackness is the ultimate object of oppression in the way that we think about it in our country. And so what that does is we try to, you know, give Black people the authority, but really what that does is it puts the labor on Black folks to be the voice of it. And institutions oftentimes just wait until Black people say something to actually address and acknowledge that something is detrimental to the institution. So that's oftentimes what it looks like. And of course it looks like many other things as well, but these are just three that he highlighted in his presentation. And the consequences of that is that we're invalidating the experiences of people of color, because we're not acknowledging, right? So when we think about the Asian American students who had no one show up because everyone else is thinking, oh, well, they're getting support from SCORE, they're getting support from that faculty in sociology, they're getting support from, you know, the counselors. And then what ends up happening is everyone's hands are off and then there's no one who's acknowledging. That can ultimately, of course, have negative academic and professional outcomes for not just our students, but for faculty, right? For faculty, for administrators who then feel the burden of having to be the one while also nursing their own emotions, while also coping with their own reality of what this means for them and their own safety. And that, of course, creates more unresolved racial tensions that we can't avoid, right? And what he also talked about is that, you know, you actually just create more of a potential eruption and embarrassment of the institution when folks avoid the conversation. So it's more just to say that this is something that we all have a stake in. We all have a responsibility, that we can't just wait for those inevitable institutional statements that come out, but that it's really the care and the acknowledgement has to happen at every level. At every level, students and colleagues need to feel that the community is attentive to the conditions that we're living in. And then of course that, you know, creates a recycling of racially harmful actions and And in this case, these are examples that are not specific to like the large nationally recognized racial incidents. He's really in this moment talking about when we see these things, microaggressions happening, these small slights, you know, institutional inequities happening, that these are the ways that we avoid them, and these are the consequences of avoiding them. And I really appreciated that he used this phrase, graduating accidental racists, because what that does is we reward people, or we allow them to continue on with engaging in problematic practices or behavior that then they just continue to think is okay. Because, you know, there's that one person, you know, Emily, who's known for doing these awful things in the classroom around, South Asian student identity, or, you know, whatever it might be. And then no one wants to say anything, and, oh, well, that's just Emily. And then we just allow Emily to continue being Emily. And no one is saying anything because everyone is like, well, that's not my responsibility. I don't want to get involved in that. Right. So how do we lean in and think about the impact, the large impact and ripple effect that avoiding these little small and big moments might have on each other, on folks of color in particular. I can't remember what is on the next slide, Mary, and I'm not sure.
It's the strategy, so I think it's right.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. So I don't know if folks have questions about that last slide, or additional examples that you'd like to share as we think about what avoidance looks like.
I was going to throw one thing out there, which I think responds to some of the things where here I am, this white, middle-aged, full professor, and sharing my experiences. What does that mean? And I think it is important when you say, don't wait for the big racist moments, right? The big racial violence, because what I've learned is if I can tell my students from the start that I want to create this safe space where everyone feels welcome and that I acknowledge that they all come from different backgrounds, and we spend a little time at that at the beginning, then I'm better situated to respond to things as they happen versus trying to jump in after a crisis. So that would be my tidbit for people, is setting up that sort of relationship and saying, I really want to create a space where everybody gets to be successful, where everybody is heard. And if that isn't happening, let me know how I can improve, or, and so then they see it as an authentic thing versus a statement that came out only when there was something big. And I think that helps a bit.
Yeah, no, that is so, so true. I mean, really, when you create, I know we asked you all to sort of think about what's your biggest fear, right? And really those fears only come alive when you haven't already cultivated that culture in your classroom, where that trust is not already established, right? So Mary, you just bring up such a great point about being proactive rather than reactive. And because we live in a world that is racist, right? Like, it's a part of our history. We cannot ignore it. We cannot escape it. So we actually know that racist incidents will happen. We know that they will happen on the national level and at the local level. We will witness them. And so how do you prepare and create the trust, create the accountability so that students trust your intentions and trust where you're coming from, even if you do say the wrong thing, right? Like, even if you do say something that's offensive, if you've already created a track record to demonstrate that you're committed to racial equity and you're committed to bringing truth around, elevating the truth around these issues, then folks are going to be a lot more likely to trust your intent and forgive if you make a mistake. So, so the last slide that we just kind of wanted to share is, just strategies for acknowledging. And we've already kind of talked a little bit about this, but these are examples that Sean shared. And some of them, I will admit, I'm not sure. I think you have to be mindful again of who you are, what's your skill set, what's your knowledge level around these issues. But the first that he shared was, using case studies and vignettes to stimulate conversation. So I know oftentimes we think, oh, well, these conversations only should happen in like history classes or sociology classes, or, but even if you teach a chemistry class, right, Mary? Like, you can still find ways to think about how the history of this country and the perpetual nature of race and racism exists, and find ways to include that in conversation, so that again, when these incidents happen, you've already normalized that talking about race is an okay thing to happen in your class. He also talked about how using polls, which can or cannot be anonymous depending on what it is, might be useful in, sort of gaining perspective and range around student experiences so that folks can feel heard, right? Like they don't necessarily need to say this is, raise their hand and say a big statement in class, but like, how do you create opportunities for people to feel heard and seen around these conversations? Create room for students to share their racialized experiences, use this as an opportunity. Now, again, I think Mary mentioned this earlier, but if you allow folks just time to process, think about the ways that you can actually utilize that time to affirm and validate students of color in their experiences. So allow them to talk about like, yeah, I experienced a microaggression during orientation and I didn't know what to do. My roommate said this to me and I didn't, and I was really upset. I called my parents and they, like allowing that to be an opportunity, not just for them to pour their hearts out and feel vulnerable, but then how do you comfort them with saying, I'm really sorry that happened. Yeah, I understand. I would be upset too. And you know what? We're going to do our best to address this, right? Like think about ways to comfort people and give them the opportunity to feel validated. Other considerations that we've added to this list is just more practical, right? So in thinking about, the Chauvin trial, like, okay, how can you, if possible, offer flexibility for attendance to class the following week or day, right? Like, do you absolutely need people to show up that day? Or can you record a lecture? Can you think about other ways for them to have an asynchronous experience so that they can be on their own and process through this really heavy collective moment that we are all encountering? Make yourself available as a safe person to talk about the current political moment. So if that's open office hours and being really clear, like I'm here, I want to make myself available to process through if you don't have anyone else to do that with. I love to lead breathing and meditation exercises at the start, in the past when I've taught classes, graduate level classes, and then now with the SCORE student staff, I don't open up any meeting without a 5-minute breathing exercise. I just think it's an opportunity for me to let them know I'm aware of their humanity. And also it's a way to ensure that they know I'm giving you 5 minutes to bring your full self here. Like whatever other things you're doing, like looking at your email, talking on the phone, helping your parents cook, like I'm giving you 5 minutes to bring your full self to this space. And we're gonna do that together. And that's helpful over Zoom. And then the last one is, which I think is a cool thing to consider, is just inviting a counselor or a student affairs professional to come to your class and help you to facilitate a conversation around this if you don't personally feel like you have the ability or skill set or comfort to do this on your own. That's what we're here for, right? Like, and that's what the counselors are here for. I've invited folks from MCAS a ton, and they're super helpful and useful when I don't feel personally, specifically as a Black woman, if I don't have the emotional capacity to do it, it's helpful to have someone else to co-facilitate with me. So I know I just talked a lot, but I just wanted to kind of get through these strategies, and I'm sure you all have a ton more that you could probably offer as well.
So we wanted to give you a little time, like thinking about those strategies and thinking about other ones that you have used or other ones you've heard that you want to use. We're a lot smaller now, so if we wanted to just do that as a large group, we could, or if you think going and just chatting it out in your small groups and then coming back, we can go either way at this point. Maybe what I'll say is in the chat, let me know if you'd like to go to breakout rooms. You can just say breakout rooms, and that way we'll have a sense. And if, okay. Okay, I think it seems like people are happy to just stay in the large group, so we'll do that instead. So I think it would be really great to hear either what you have done or what you would like to do in your classroom, because this is one of those anti-racist practices. How do you address racial violence? How are you going to do that moving forward, or how have you done that, so that we can all learn from each other and feel more confident about doing that? So I'll just shut up now and open it up. You can raise your hands or just yell out. Esther.
Yeah, I actually mentioned this in our previous small group. Something that I've done that seemed to work very well was, and this was in my classical sociological theory class. So that's basically the class where we talk about the founders of the discipline. And most of the famous ones are white old European men, right? So Marx, Weber, and so on. And what I did last time was, I usually taught the class, and this is what is usually the case, chronologically. And what I did was, and I think that was actually implementing a suggestion from one of these CTL workshops that I attended. I started with Du Bois, who for many of us is also the founder of US sociology, and also, the female founders of the discipline and other people that are not usually associated with sociology, people we usually think of as activists, but not founders of sociology. I actually learned a lot about that too. Like I didn't know that many of these figures were sociologists either. So that helped a lot because it reframed the conversation for the entire semester. We had that discussion at the very beginning of the semester, and I called it something like recentering the excluded. So we started with that discussion, and that helped a lot. And I also wanted to comment, I said it in the chat, but I want to say it again. I really like that idea of using the polls for this too, like to see where my students are at. I've used the polls, especially the polls on Zoom, to get like very fast, information about where people are, but I haven't done it for this. And I think that's a great idea.
Thanks, Esther. Katie.
So I teach, I'm a chemist, and I've been doing general chemistry all this year on Zoom. And one thing that we've been doing, which it was also, Mary, I was co-teaching with Mary, so we had some good ideas from her, but is to include highlighting a Black scientist every week at the beginning of we've flipped the classroom, so we do video lectures that the students watch. And so we have a slide that talks about a really interesting Black scientist. We've been trying to highlight chemists, but science in general. And that's been really great because I think, a lot of the chemistry textbooks have a lot of old white men in them. There's actually just a study that came out where people studied general chemistry textbooks and said we really need to be better at highlighting everybody. But that's been really great because I think it helps the students to see that we care about race in our class, even though we're teaching general chemistry, and it does help us to have the conversations. It's still hard, I'll admit. But it's been really a great experience doing that this year.
Well, and I think one of the ways that it was done, which I think works, is, and the first slide says that we acknowledge that chemistry and that science has been particularly culpable in the racism in America. And so letting students, like, we have a statement and it's quiet, and there's just this statement that says we get this, and we know that there are contributions from people of color who have not been highlighted, and that the numbers are just far too low. And so by having a statement where we say that, and then we also admit, like we say, our department is too white and we don't even have people for you to come to, so we want to show you others. I definitely feel like the students commented a lot on that in their evals at the end of the semester, because it was just, they recognized that we were helping, right? That we acknowledge that. And that's that same idea of acknowledging that racism exists and that there's racial violence. I think it's worked well. And Katie, I think you guys have done a great job continuing that and making it a culture in the classroom. Like I was only there at the beginning and you've kept it going. And so it's really become a culture in chemistry that I think is really important.
Mhm.
I see there's great stuff going on in the chat. Other people want to share what they've done or something that they're hoping to take from this to their classroom? If not this spring, something they might want to try, with their new students in the fall. Sharda.
Yeah, I was just gonna, this made me think of kind of 3 moments in my career so far where I've tried different things. My very first year at CMC, for those of you who've been around for a little bit, was when the students of color and marginalized groups basically protested and had a hunger strike and all of this stuff go on. And that was my very first semester. And I definitely felt sort of an expectation from my students looking at me that I be able to articulately deal with or explain to them, majority white in my classroom, what these other students were experiencing. And that was an incredibly uncomfortable moment. But in trying to figure out what to do, I basically just said, okay, at the end of class, like, I'll end early. For those of you who want to talk about what's going on, we can talk about what's going on. And for those of you who are good, like, that's fine. So one thing I took away from that was, okay, I definitely had to make it voluntary. I was glad that I did. But it was also a moment in that slightly smaller group where I could say, I have no idea. I've been here for just a few minutes. I don't know what to say. What do you guys think is going on? And so I think in that sense, kind of my ignorance was a way to get them to open up and not make it about like what I think as their professor about how they should feel. The other instance that this made me think of was when I had the wonderful opportunity to give an exam the day after the 2016 election. That was really, really, really fun. And, mere hours before, we had like an emergency faculty meeting and I had a bunch of senior people tell me that I should cancel the exam. And I had intended to still give it because they were ready. They had prepared all of that stuff and there was literally no other time that I could give them this exam. And so in that case, I came in with this long prepared speech and I started with, you've never had me have a speech in front of me. And now I'm going to say all the things I have to say to you before you take this exam. But just for the next hour and 15 minutes, kind of set aside the world, take this exam, and we will deal with the consequences later. But yes, I know you're hurting. I am too. Everything is a mess, but I know you're ready because you didn't study just last night. You've been preparing for ages. And so I think that was the point where I did the opposite of kind of giving them the space. And I said, my door is going to be open after this, but just do this for this hour and 15 minutes. And I was so terrified of my evals for that semester. And actually they were like the best I've ever had. And no one mentioned that I made them take the exam after the election. So I think one heartening thing is that students' memories can also be somewhat short-lived. So that was a moment where I was like, if I had really messed up, I didn't have to be so scared that I would never live it down, sort of. Yeah. So I think those are the 2 examples I would give of times that I've tried to do this that really stood out to me.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's tough. The exam times. I mean, I had an exam scheduled for the day before the students were leaving campus, right? So COVID's happening. The students were asking, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I was like, I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Do we still want to have the exam? Yes, we want to have the exam. But then all of a sudden it's like, okay, you're all leaving. And do we want to have this exam right before you're all leaving? And it's interesting because I was trying to communicate with the students and I had a student say, it's ridiculous that you're still having this test that, none of us want to take it. And I said, I had to write back and say, well, actually, there's a bunch of students who said they do the final to count more and they've prepared. So I ended up making it optional, but it was that kind of thing where there were clearly students who thought they had the right answer and they knew what everybody wanted, and other students had the exact opposite answers. So that idea of being open to them and letting them help tell us it's that idea of them sharing their experiences. And some people wanted probably for your exam to take their mind off the election, and they worked really hard and they didn't want to lose that chance. And then there's others that were like, I can't think at all. So we do have to think on the fly a lot, and it's that generosity and that empathy and that willing to be flexible that I think make a really big difference.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I think as we consider when is the time to like make these exceptions, of course we can think of the elections as a big time. And I would also challenge us to think about the ways that, like, depending on one's positionality and set of identities, like an issue might not be an issue, right? Like, I remember 2016 elections, I had so many, I was still a PhD student, and so many of my colleagues in my program, white colleagues, came to me and were like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life, like the next day. And like me and like the other Black PhD students were like, we knew this was gonna happen. This is our reality. Like, we live this every day. This really is not devastating I mean, it was devastating. That's not to diminish the impact of it, but because of the lives that we live and because of the daily impact of anti-Blackness and all the history that we've encountered, it really affected us in a very different way from other folks, right? And so I just want to highlight that, that like it's important for us to think about these collective moments where we all might be experiencing something, but that something might look different based off of what your relationship is to this country, what your relationship is to mainstream politics, right? So so just to be mindful of that as well. And I know that that's not like a direct response to your comment, Sharda, but I think it's a good way to kind of consider, like, when you make those exceptions, how do you think about it from multiple different perspectives?
Anybody else have anything else they want to share? We're closing in on wrap-up time, and we certainly don't have to stay till 1:30. So, but I want to be sure that people get the chance to either share something or ask a question before you move on about the rest of your busy day. All right, well then I'm going to turn it over to Jessica. Let's see if